So access and equity, an examination, a discussion of standardized admission testing is what we're going to be unpacking in a sense today. And from the viewpoint of various stakeholders and a variety of perspectives. In terms of kind of unpacking access and equity, there's access to the test, right, itself. There's equitable access to that test. There's access to higher education through the use of the standardized test and a way to open doors. Equity in the sense of kind of fairness and impartiality as a way of providing students from different backgrounds an opportunity to show their potential for success, yet on the other hand, the biases that exist within the standardized admission tests. So just to get a pulse of the room, we're going to do a quick audience poll by show of fingers, thumbs up or thumbs down. Get your perspective on a few elements of standardized admission testing, or standardized testing generally. First, standardized tests objectively compare student skill levels across schools. Primarily thumbs down. All right. Standardized testing is paired with standards to ensure mastery of grade-appropriate material. All right. Standardized testing can serve as a motivation for students. I see thumbs down, some in between, some head shakes. All right. Standardized test data drives instruction. And the mentality of perhaps teaching to the test. And standardized testing helps schools close achievement gaps. So this is by far the element where we see the most kind of diversity in our perspectives. So again, we're going to be unpacking some of this as it relates to stakeholders from students to counselors and universities. And it's great to see such a mixed audience because you're going to get a chance to engage with our panel as well. With that, we will start with introductions. My name is Lindsay Addington. I'm the Director of Global Engagement for the National Association for College Admission Counseling, based outside of Washington, D.C. in the U.S. I've been with NACA for about 6 years, and testing has been a topic that's been on my radar for those 6 years. And so we'll talk a little bit about NACA's engagement in the testing environment. And I'll turn it over to our panelists.
Good morning, I'm Bridget Herrera. I'm in my 4th year at the American International School of DACA. Prior to that, I was in Latin America for 30 years. I am on International ACAC's ad hoc committee on international admissions testing, and I've been an SAT supervisor for years as well as ACT until recently.
My name is Eloise Hyman. I'm an admissions officer from the University of Chicago. I've been in this role for about 3 years.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Lindsay Skeens. I'm a Senior Assistant Director of Undergraduate Admission at the George Washington University in Washington, D.C., and I've been in this role just short of 3 years.
So we're going to take both a historical kind of look at standardized testing up to current day, talk about standardized testing kind of in a global landscape, and talk specifically about some of the nuances around the test optional movement and what that means for counselors and schools who either have a policy or are considering a policy around test optional. And you might ask, why is NACA involved in standardized testing? And I am by no means the standardized testing expert, and we have a few colleagues in the room that can speak more to several tests, SAT with Clay and Duolingo with Jen. ACT, I think, is also doing a session next door to us. So we do have those experts. But why is NACA involved? It is a major element and has been since our inception as an organization, a major element of the college admission process. We are a membership organization of college counselors and university admission professionals. And by responsibility to them, it is our effort to provide guidance, to provide research, to provide suggestions for how to go about utilizing standardized admission testing in their practices from the university angle, but also kind of in a support for counselors who serve, as Bridget said, as those who help students prepare for tests and know which tests to take and how that plays into the college admission process, and then also kind of as the face of some standardized testing as the test administrators and proctors. We are by no means kind of as an organization, we will by no means say to an institution what should be your policy. But again, with the perspective of offering data and guidance to make aware some of the situations that are occurring from our members' perspective is our goal in having this and facilitating conversations around standardized testing. So, through my part in kind of the overview of standardized testing, briefly talk about kind of the historical role of standardized testing in college admission, an introductory knowledge of predictive validity, which is why institutions use standardized testing, talk briefly about the test optional movement and what that means, as well as the trend towards self-reporting, as well as learn best ethical practices in admission testing based on NACA engagement and research on this topic. We will spend then time hearing from Bridget and the case studies from GW and from Chicago, and then we're going to open it up to kind of a panel dialogue and discussion, which will then give you an opportunity as well to speak with our panelists. So again, I am by no means a standardized admission testing historian, but I thought in terms of context around how these tests were created to meet a need among the higher education community, and how they've evolved over the years to reflect changes that institutions have wanted, I think is important. This is kind of an evolving process, and needs of our institutions and of students are changing. And so a brief history, and Clay, correct me if any of this is wrong, but the College Board was created in the 1900s. Typically, institutions prior to this time had their own kind of entrance requirements, an interview, or they used a high school certificate issued by the school to verify students' preparedness for collegiate study. And in the 1900s, the College Board was created to offer a group of institutions in the eastern United States an opportunity to have a standardized essay test for students among the institutions. In 1926, after the Army had developed a series of intelligence tests to kind of assign military professionals into different categories of what their role within the Army would be, we find that the Scholastic Aptitude Test was created by the College Board, kind of the official kind of fill-in-the-bubble test to assess students' aptitude for learning. In 1959, we see the competitor exam through the ACT program, which saw a role for them to play in assessing academic preparedness and achievement as opposed to aptitude for learning. There are also some regional differences in where these tests were being offered. And then in 1993, the SAT changed its name to Scholastic Assessment Tests. And this was to go against the idea that the test measured something innate versus something that could be influenced by preparation and effort. And then in 1996 and 1997, the organizations dropped their acronyms. They no longer stood for anything. And in 2005, we saw the major revision to the SAT and the ACT as the writing section. And again, that's significant in that it was responsive to some institutional needs, primarily through the University of California system. I think we have some UC schools represented here who may be able to speak to that as well. So that's the history of the exams, and again, to show the evolution of the exams and being responsive to the higher ed needs. Now, the role of tests in admission decision is something that NACA has researched through our State of College Admission Report for the last 15, I think now almost 20 years. And we look at various factors that universities consider, and these are US universities, consider in the admission decision. And you can see over the years, and this is ranked on the left by the first 2007 ranking of what institutions consider as considerably important in the admission decision. And you can see the grade admission test scores. Over the last 5 years in particular, the data is suggestive of a trend that institutions are putting less emphasis on the standardized testing. And this also mirrors some of the changes we're seeing in the field with regard to institutions going test optional. Now, to better understand, again, just this is the brief kind of overview of predictive validity, right? The causal relationship between a variable and an outcome. And so with regard to assessing students and trying to predict their success in college, right, which is what we're all trying to do through the application review and admission process, those variables that go into trying to predict that success include the high school GPA, ACT and SAT scores, subject test scores, college prep curriculum and GPA, family income. All of these variables are things that we, through a holistic admission process, particularly at selective institutions, really hone in on. And the outcome that has been historically looked at is first-year GPA. Going back to the University of California system, due to the sheer number of students that submit exam scores over the years through the California system, the president at the time, I think in 2001, asked for more research on the predictive validity of standardized testing. And so numerous studies between 2001 and 2005 showcase some of this variance as related to high school GPA, subject tests, and the SAT. And now no longer are subject tests required, but they had this data for a large group of students, over 77,000 students, to look at. And this study, and then further studies since, do show that there is greater high school GPA is a greater indicator of success than standardized testing. And you can see the variance added by accepting high school GPA plus looking at SAT or subject tests here. But the debate, this started to initiate conversations among the higher education community. And one of the things, again, that NACA is a proponent of, there is not a one-size-fits-all approach to standardized testing, but one of the things that NACA really does promote is that institutions should know and do predictive validity tests of their own students and know whether or not standardized admission tests help them make better admission decisions and are better predictors of success for their students. A few years back, NACA surveyed its members, and of those that do require standardized admission testing, only about half, just more than half of the institutions are doing predictive validity studies. And again, one of the things that NACA urges is that as a best practice, institutions are assessing this, right? And if they require the test, they know and can state definitively that this is helping them make better admission decisions. So the critics of standardized testing, and many of the reasons why you probably put your thumbs down at the very beginning, are based on some of these critiques of standardized testing, teaching to the test, dictating what is taught, a mismatch between what is taught at the high school level and what is being assessed through these standardized tests. And I think kind of as we explore through Bridget's and the International ACEC's research that they have done over the last year, or study of kind of factors influencing standardized testing in a global environment, we see some of these others: costs to students, test preparation, access to test preparation, and the fact that it does have an effect on performance of standardized tests, whether or not it leads to better admission decisions. And I think probably more so from a U.S. domestic standpoint, what has been driving the test optional movement is the cultural and social biases that exist within the test and creating better access for students. So we see kind of this developing research being conducted on an institutional basis, both, and then the national kind of perspective taking on standardized admission testing and its role. And we go back to Bowdoin being the first school to eliminate standardized testing requirements, but I think more instrumental in current day situation is Bates Having been test optional since 1984, at NACA's conference 20 years after that, they released a longitudinal study which showed that there were not significant differences in those students who either submitted scores and didn't submit scores. And this, I think, is what really prompted more of the movement we're seeing on a daily basis. I just got the notice that Colorado College has just gone test optional. And so the conversation is happening. And I think what we as an organization are happy about is that people are figuring out what works best for them. And for some, it still may be standardized testing helps to make those better informed decisions. For others, it may not. But what does that mean for, so again, we're seeing all of this in the news and kind of the buzz in the field. And what does that mean for international students in particular? Just to briefly, as we have both a test optional and test flexible school, these are the formal definitions of test optional, not mandatory for students to submit for test optional. Test flexible allows students to submit various standardized tests to meet the requirement, and then test blind is that students are not required to submit any test scores. Elizabeth Redden, probably a month or so ago now for Inside Higher Education, trade publication, took a look at what this means for international students. There is not a comprehensive formal list for international students, and oftentimes you will find various policies for both domestic and international students from U.S. universities that are choosing to go test optional or flexible, and it's not consistent. And for the counselors in the room, that makes your job that much harder to help students figure out what that means for them, and if they're applying to multiple schools, if some schools require, some schools are flexible, some schools are optional, what that means for the students that you're counseling. Some institutions may not require it, but then they do for scholarship. What does that mean? And so this is a very complex situation that we find ourselves in. Yes. Yeah. So I think that it's not, they're not taking into consideration at all. Like you're not.
Yeah, I think that definition may be a little confusing.
Okay.
Test blind means that even if submitted, it's not considered. And there's only, I think, one college in the U.S. Maybe one more that does that.
Thank you for clarifying.
Just to make sure that the terms.
Great. Thank you, Clay. And so the other trend that we're seeing is, and this is also for the purpose of increasing access and trying to eliminate some of the upfront costs of applying to colleges, is the self-reporting option. And we're seeing this grow and anticipate that it will continue to grow, currently at 115 colleges and universities in the U.S. So NACA's engagement on the topic really dates back to the 2008 commission report. It was a 3-year commission that the NACA board felt was necessary at the time to look at that time, what had been a 10-year trend in complexity around standardized admission testing. This is a very comprehensive report that I encourage you all, if you have any interest in the history or the role that standardized testing plays in admission and guidance for how, as an institution, you should be assessing your use of standardized testing. This is a fantastic report. And then more recently, with our engagement with International ACAC, have been advocating on behalf of our members with the testing organizations and trying to educate our college and university members about the issues that international students face with regard to access and equity in the college admission requirements. College admission landscape. And then most recently, per last year's National Assembly, which is a group of our members that help direct the governance and guide the association, it was voted for the board to examine standardized testing in an international environment again. And in response to that, the board has issued a task force or a panel to advise the association on further educating the public and our members about issues in the international testing landscape. So just to end my part some best practices, best ethical practices with regard to standardized testing, and practices that I believe the testing organizations also agree with. Colleges should not use a minimum test score as the sole criterion, very basic. They should familiarize themselves with published standards. Again, stay informed on what's happening in the testing environment. It cannot just be status quo. Conduct research into the predictive validity, which is what NACA encouraged through its research and report 2 years ago. Report the middle 50%. There's a human tendency to process averages as a benchmark, and this tries to get past that. And then keeping test results in perspective through the holistic review of college admission counseling. So with that backdrop, we'll turn it over to Bridget to head into International ACAC's engagement on the topic.
Thank you, Lindsay. Good morning, everybody. Thank you for coming. Can I get a show of hands of who's on the university side here? Great. You know, one thing I feel is important, I think there's a lot of things going on out there in our testing world, the world of counselors internationally and test center supervisors that many of our colleagues on the college side have no knowledge about. And I think it's important for you to know what students go through, what we go through. It's been a pleasure to be on this committee. It was work that interests me greatly, and we were led by Anne Richardson from the American School of London. She did a really great job. So the background is that it was created in June 2018, and we were charged with facilitating communication between our members, the NACA community, or leadership really, testing agencies, all regarding international testing. And so when we're talking about international testing, we're throwing sort of a broad blanket, SAT, ACT, TOEFL, IELTS in particular. When necessary, we acted as advocates for the counseling community especially, and that happened quite often. And we conducted research when necessary. The way that we worked was, it was all online, and we did have some conversations, but most of it was meeting back and forth via emails. As I said, Anne did a wonderful job. And really, 2018, 2019, our last academic year, was really a tumultuous year in standardized testing for those of us internationally. First of all, ACT went to the computer-based exam, which is not all bad, but it took away the option of many of the schools who had previously been test centers to actually continue to be a test center, because it required you to have computer labs with very particular setups. And many of us are, bring your own device schools, so we were no longer able to serve in that capacity, which meant ACT had to establish testing centers in different parts of the cities. What this left many students with in particular countries was no place to test if they wanted to take the ACT. There were, of course, major hiccups with that. There were continued security breaches with the SAT. There was a lack of communication on a number of levels. Test center staffs were not paid. Whoops, pardon me, I think that's my notes. Making that happen. Test center staff members were not made. And so it was a year where there was a lot of work for this committee to do. And so how we actually operated was often we would pick up things on the International ACAC Facebook page. Counselors writing, I've got this problem going on. How do I resolve it? And we would share the information with the committee, and then Anne would liaison with testing individuals from SAT, ACT, etc. People were very forthcoming, very helpful. Clay, of course, as well. And people really tried to help with some of these issues, but there were many. You'll see later in the resources that we've shared a copy of the full report, and you can see the kind of issues that were coming up throughout the year. And these are issues that, you know, may have affected counselors, the kind of time we had to spend, but also really impacted students. You know, that's the hardest part. Students who traveled very far to get to a test center only to find it canceled. Students who took a test, you know, having worked so hard to prepare, only to find those scores canceled because there was perhaps a security breach. Those are the kind of things that are the most heartbreaking. So as you can see, for the international students, the most difficult, you know, the biggest problems we're facing is access, equity, and test security and reliability. And remember, I'm talking about the international community, but it does include U.S. citizens living abroad. So it is not just international students. Let's just have a look at some of the access issues and equity. First of all, you can see just the sheer number of tests that we have had available, whereas domestic students in the U.S. have 7 test dates a year. We have internationally 4. That makes planning ever so much more important. That makes the cancellation of a test, for whatever reason the tests don't arrive, there is a weather issue, a political issue, it leaves students with far fewer options. I believe, Clay, can you tell me, in August 2021, will we be having an extra test? Okay, thank you. Likewise, you can see in terms of cost, you know, the student testing abroad is paying a great deal more. It was kind of baffling to me that the ACT, you know, when they went to the computer-based test, I thought, like, oh, I mean, could be something really great, because there's no cost of shipping materials and returning them, no cost of printing materials, and yet, I mean, the cost skyrocketed. And you know, the fact that there are no fee waivers is also another big issue. So our students having fewer test dates are also paying so much more. And I don't know if our friends on the college side realize that when you start to add up the cost of applying to universities, especially in the States, when you include all the testing and the admission fees and all, it is a lot. So for the test center supervisor, and I am an advocate for my people, you know, we often are the face of the testing agency. Our students don't know Simi or Clay or anyone based in the US. They think we are SAT. They think we are ACT. And so when we run into problems, they look to us for answers and quick answers. But unfortunately, we don't always get quick answers. There have been, you know, when there are cancellations, word on that doesn't come out until maybe 12 hours before the test center. I'm fortunate in that mine is a closed test center, so I can alert all of my students. But if you're like the International School of DACA testing 200 students, you don't have any way to contact the students in who you'll be testing that next day. There have been lockbox issues, payment for those serving as test supervisors and proctors, and communication issues. There was one time when our tests did not arrive, and we were getting close to the test date. And obviously, my counterpart in the U.S., we're on different time zones, but I'm certainly always taking that into consideration. Well, one night, in the middle of the night, it must have been midnight or so, I get a phone call, and, my heart stops. Oh, my gosh, one of my kids or something. No, it's NACA calling to ask if my test had arrived, something like that. And it's like those kind of things we need to think about and be sensitive to. That was my petty little comment. And so the recommendations from the committee were to advocate for access and equity in the testing of international students and U.S. citizens abroad. And this is, of course, all in the testing report. And we're looking at sites and dates, seats. I know the test centers are aware of that. We're happy to have newcomers like Duolingo out here offering us new options to the testing scenario. Obviously, we're asking to advocate with our university administrators. I will say on this committee, we had a number of university representatives from a wide variety of institutions, and they were very much unaware of the situation in terms of standardized testing. So if you have deans that you can go back to and talk with us about, we do appreciate it. We're advocating for self-reported testing being accepted for all, etc. And then I just, from the counselor's desk, representing all of counselors, Lindsay already mentioned it, that we're thrilled with the test optional and flexible opportunities coming forward all the time. I'm thrilled with the self-reporting opportunities, but it's still very much unclear if it's for international students. Every time I see something come out from Bob Schaefer, I'm just like, yay, does it include international students? And it doesn't always. Recently in the summer NACA journal, Lauren Cook from California wrote an opinion piece, Standardized Testing Rules Our Lives. It's so true. It's so true. When you want to sit down and have a talk with a student about how they spent their summer, or why they want to attend a particular institution so badly, oftentimes it turns to, should I take the test again? When is going to be the best time to take it? And it really takes away from what could be such rich conversations. And with that, this I think will be on the PowerPoint that will be shared, but I hope you'll find the resources useful. And I'll turn it over to the next person.
Hi, everyone. Good morning. I'm also Lindsay. I'm from the George Washington University. We're in Washington, D.C. And so Eloise and I are now going to take a few minutes and give you some information about our institutions that are, I'm test optional, and the University of Chicago is test flexible. So the George Washington University, just a general overview. This year before summer melt, we enrolled 2,886 students. So we are a little bit under that now that we have started school. This year, we were about 70-30% with test submitters and non-test submitters. And then for the students who did submit tests, our middle 50% of the ACT was between 30 and 33, and SAT was between 1310 and 1440. We are an institution that is completely test optional. For international students, for domestic students, and let me back up, when I say completely test optional, there are a few exceptions, but it's not for international students. I'll get to the exceptions here shortly, but they are exceptions that we don't have much control over, NCAA athletes being one of them. So when I say test optional, there is no catch. We say to students, if you want to submit tests, you can. If you don't want to submit tests, you don't have to. If you could have a 1600 on the SAT, but the day you are filling out your application, you could not feel like going to the College Board website and submitting it, and that's absolutely fine. There is no catch. We still consider students for scholarships without their SATs, international and domestic. If a student submits their scores, we're going to look at them. If they don't submit their scores, we're not going to look at them. On our Common Application page, it asks students, are you submitting test scores? If they select yes, it creates an indicator in our checklist that they see on their academic portal. Then we're going to be waiting for those scores. We hold students to that decision that they made on their application. If they say yes, they are going to be held to being a test submitter. If they say no, they're not a test submitter, and we're not going to be waiting for any scores. So why did we decide to go test optional? For the academic year of 2015-2016, we created a task force on access and affordability to think about why students weren't coming and weren't staying at the George Washington University. And so this spawned a thought about being test optional, and the admissions office picked up this thought and ran with it. So our goal was to create a simple and clear policy about testing. Our initial proposal was tests not required, but we learned that in the U.S. News and World Reports, if 70% of your students don't submit test scores, then you get dinged in the national rankings. So we then went to a test optional policy. So as you can see, we are now about 70-30. To U.S. News and World Reports and for ranking purposes, we submit all test scores that we receive, whether or not we use them in our reviews. So students who decide to be test optional but already sent us scores, we are allowed to report those, even if we don't use those in the review. So even if a student does, on their test date, put us as a recipient school on the test and send it to us, but then later decides that they don't want us to use them, we won't use them. We're going to go off of what was on the application, not what was on their test. So we also ask students who have been admitted but who applied as test optional to submit those scores to us so that we can report them for ranking purposes. We're finding that those students aren't reporting scores much different than the students who did report scores and were also admitted. So we believed that students who were capable of being successful at GW, who would be great in our applicant pool, were self-selecting out of applying to GW because they saw those SAT score ranges or those ACT score ranges. They weren't giving us the chance to say yes to them, even though we very likely would have said yes to them. So we found the first year when we went test optional that the high schools that we were getting applications from exploded. Typically, we get applications from the same 500 high schools no matter how hard we tried. The first year we went test optional, we got applications from high schools we had never seen before. The first year also, we got an increase of applications from underrepresented students by 33%. So we were able to see really significant gains just by going test optional. So this is just our definition. We're also test optional for our transfer students. It looks a little bit differently because of the rankings and everything. We don't even really look at tests for our transferring students. This is a very long definition. I'm not going to read it out. But the short of it at GW is there are no consequences to not submitting your scores. We don't think one Saturday morning should solely determine where you spend the next 4 years of your academic life. And we understand that students have different resources to prepare for this test. A lot of why we did this was because of access, nationally and internationally. And those exceptions that I did mention are recruited NCAA Division I athletes. They say we have to take scores for them. We have a program which is a Bachelor of Arts and Medical Doctor program. Those students are required to submit SAT or ACT scores to us as well as SAT 2 tests. That program has less than a 1% acceptance rate, so we do have to have those scores and able to make the most informed decision. homeschool applicants, we do need that additional information and able to make an informed decision. And then schools, a lot of schools in the States, private schools, won't give us any grades. They'll just give us a narrative of how the student performed in high school. So we do need some sort of quantitative measure of how those students performed. So very quickly, the outcomes of our test optional policy. The first year we went test optional, like I said, the number of high schools that we received applications from went through the roof. Test optional students had a higher affinity for GW, maybe because they didn't think they could. They always maybe reached for GW. It was a reach, but now they saw it as a possibility. These students yielded higher. And then last but not least, our early indicators now, they're just now sort of processing through their 4 years at GW, that these students are doing just as well in the academic setting at GW as test submitters when controlling for their academics. And then we get some frequently asked questions. I think we're going to save those for here shortly. So I'm going to go ahead and hand it over to Eloise to chat about Chicago.
All right, thank you. So the University of Chicago, we did just this past admission cycle go test flexible. So a lot of that data is still to be evaluated, but so it can give you a bit of a look at what we were already seeing of high application numbers in a very highly selective institution, with about 16% of our first year class being international. Now I will say that is not a quota. I just always want to make very sure of that when we're looking at percentages, but it is just sort of understanding that we do have a strong representation in both our applicant pool and in our first year class. Test flexible for this cycle, very similar to what we were talking about with GW and looking on the international scale of understanding the access that is different that students will have, whether they are in the US in different parts and internationally, and allows students to decide what information best represents their skills and college readiness. That might be standardized test scores, that might be separate than just the SAT, it might be subject tests, it might be other forms of evaluation. And so we want to give students that flexibility, and I will show in just a second what that test flexible really means for us. I can say, while we don't have all of the data yet, it was a fairly smooth transition, because with the holistic review that we already find to be such an important part, as we've heard so much that test scores are not the only indicator of how we are evaluating applications, it was fairly easy to switch into a mode of not having the SAT, the ACT, and evaluating the rest of the application. And that testing is not necessary for need-based nor merit aid, so this shouldn't be a concern for students who do need financial aid to attend the University of Chicago. And the first year outcome, well, as I said, we are still needing to see how that comes out with this first year class. The students admitted are proportional to students who applied under this test flexible policy, so it has been quite successful in that first year. What test flexible means for us is, for English language proficiency, if a student has not had 2 years in a school where the primary teaching language is English, we will need some form of English language proficiency, TOEFL, IELTS, or the Duolingo English test. But then the rest of the flexibility, it could be the ACT or the SAT. We will super score, we will self-report, but we will talk about that in a little bit. Or it could be the predicted or final IB if a student is in that curriculum, A-levels, or 3 or more SAT subject tests. I do want to be very clear here, the only time I need the SAT subject test is if that is the only form of testing. I'm not asking for that in addition to SAT, in addition to ACT, in addition to IB, A-levels, what have you. It is only if that is the only testing I see. And for the APs, I am only considering those as part of the application review if it, again, is the only form of testing, and if a student is in an AP curriculum. So we do look very closely to see, is this school actually offering the AP curriculum? So if a student is not in that AP curriculum, the APs are not used as a part of that application review. I will also say some of our frequently asked questions are also looking at, is there a score cutoff, especially with that flexibility? No, it really is just sort of understanding, is this representative of what that student feels their academic skills are? If there's discrepancy, no student will be negatively impacted by not submitting, and it is not about citizenship, it is about where the high school is, because again, we want to understand all of the additional context that we have of where they are. We are still seeing how we can expand this, especially as an accessibility question, as we have understood through NACAC's finding, through international ACAC's findings, what is making sense for these students and these communities. But for now, this is what we are able to do. I don't want to take up too much time with just my nitty-gritty here, so I think we will go back onto the panel section of it. Oh, I don't know if the mic is on, sorry.
There we go. So for context, it was very helpful to have GW, Lindsay note that more than 2/3, 70%, which is usually right on average of what we see, maybe a little bit higher. I think nationwide we see about an 80% score submission among test optional universities. What about Chicago? In your first year, what did you see?
I think that data is about 15% applied with this test flexible or test optional on the domestic front.
On domestic, it was
yeah.
around 15?
So about that, I'm pretty sure, are those numbers. Again, still a lot of data that even I have not received yet, just because a lot of it still needs to be evaluated.
Yeah, that's very helpful for context. Thanks.
Yeah.
So kind of to dig into a little bit deeper into some of the reasons why institutions go test optional and frequently asked questions, and then how that impacts counselors' advising strategies. We're just going to dig in a bit for the next 10 minutes and then open it up to questions from the audience. Eloise shared some of her frequently asked questions. I'd love to hear from Lindsay about your top FAQ that you get from students, and then from Bridget on the counseling perspective. What is your most frequently asked question from students about this test optional movement?
I think my most asked question, it encompasses a lot of different questions at once, but is what's the catch? A lot of students say, am I still considered for scholarships? Am I at a disadvantage that you're not telling me about? And there is no catch. We are still considering students for the same merit-based scholarships as students who submitted tests, as students who didn't submit tests. If a student didn't submit test scores, I'm just skipping that part of the review. If they do submit test scores, I'm looking at test scores. I like to joke with them at college fairs that if they don't submit test scores, that's one less thing I have to look at in my review. It takes me 30 seconds less or a minute less to review that application in the 1,000 that I review all season. So there is no catch for us. I'm not lying to them. I'm not setting them up. And it's hard to grasp at first. But I really don't need test scores. And then I flip it a little bit and say, but this is a situation where test scores can hurt you. We have printed for you what our middle 50% of the SAT and the ACT are. I'm literally telling you what I want to see if you're submitting test scores to me. If you don't have that score or higher, don't give me scores, okay? I'm giving you the option to opt out of giving me something I don't want to see. That's when it can hurt you. So I'm literally being as upfront and transparent as possible. There's no catch, and this is what I don't want to see.
Why is that? I mean, why can't, if you're doing a contextual review, and you know that student is from a background, say, an underrepresented or a rural student, that doesn't have a preparation, why can't you put that score in context?
We do put that score in context.
No, then why would you not want to see it?
We understand that when we get a score, and that's what the responsibility of the counselor is. Not everybody knows that test optional doesn't have a catch. Not everybody has had the chance to see me at their high school or at a college fair. So we understand that somebody from an underrepresented area or from a rural school or something like that has had the resource of a college counselor or of seeing one of us to know that we don't want to see that score. So we do take that into consideration. That's part of our holistic review. So we're not always just going to throw out an application if we see scores we don't want to see. We take that into consideration, which is what's nice of us doing a holistic review.
And I appreciate you mentioning that not all students have counselors, and most certainly internationally. So on the high school side, probably the question I receive most is it truly optional? You know, and if I don't submit it and there are other students who submit very strong test scores, you know, am I at a disadvantage? And I think, you know, the next piece is, of course, all the minute details that have to be paid attention to all the different schools that they're applying to, just wonder like, well, should I just send it all, It's a little daunting.
Great, thank you. And to follow on from that, Bridget, how has your advising strategy changed as this movement is progressing? If you have a strong academic performer and a poor test taker, or if you have a student who within their list of schools has some test required schools and some test optional schools, has it made your job more difficult?
Oh yeah, and with age, I'm not able to just keep all the details in my head like I used to. So I'm very explicit with students. You need to look at every single page, and when you see test optional, no, keep clicking, look for international students, see what the truth is for the international student. And in terms of advising, it depends. If it's a student who needs money, are they going to need the testing to get any kind of merit scholarship? It really has become, in some ways, more complex, yet I'm still, I believe there is promise, and we're moving in the right direction.
Great, thank you. And one of the things that was brought up, and I can't remember by Eloise or Lindsay, was related to English proficiency testing, which it's not to be confused. Test optional does not mean opting out of English language proficiency, which NACA, State of College Admission Data Report, is the top factor, the top admission factor for international students. Can you just reiterate for the audience what your policy is at GW in Chicago?
So at GW, students who spend 4 years at an English language high school don't need to provide any TOEFL, IELTS, Duolingo test. That is English proficiency enough. If they have an SAT score on the evidence-based reading and writing of 650 or higher, if they have the ACT of 30, it's on the website. There's a lot of numbers in my head right now. And then also, if English is their first language. We just instituted a policy in our systems that if on the Common App they say English is their first language, we automatically waive it in the system. And then we also have an English proficiency waiver that they can fill out on our website that we can review and then possibly waive the English proficiency.
And for the University of Chicago, our official policy is 2 or more years where the primary language of instruction in the school is English. But again, we are able to have, especially if first language is English, some flexibility there, but that would be more of a case by case. For this official policy, 2 or more years of English language instruction.
Great, thank you. I think yes, question. Did you hear the question?
So when you say that 2 or more years of English language proficiency, now when a student puts an early application, at that point of time he's not reporting the IELTS or the TOEFL scores, but he's reporting the SAT scores. And when this university is not considering that, would that move the application into the regular?
So for the English language sort of proficiency test, if the student has only had 1 year of high school where they are being taught entirely in English, and the national language of the country is not also English, it's not understood that this would be a first language for that student, we will need TOEFL, IELTS, or Duolingo. If they have had 2 years, so that would be year 10, year 11, at the point of application, they do not need, in English, they do not need to additionally send those test scores.
So if our first language, so for an Indian student, we don't have a first language as English.
For Indian students, the University of Chicago, like students coming from high schools in India, we do not require English language proficiency tests.
Now, considering like a student has put an early application and without the English language proficiency, at that point of time, the checklist says that no, you need to submit.
So it wouldn't be in that checklist in this scenario that we have discussed, where say it's that high school in India that you mentioned, or student I don't need the English language proficiency test.
And I'll ask we kind of take this offline and follow up directly, just due to time. And I just want to note, and Clay often presents on this, that as this test optional movement is growing in the U.S., the test submissions for non-U.S. universities is growing. The number of universities outside the U.S. that are accepting SAT and ACT is growing, while this test optional movement in the U.S. Is also growing. And I'll ask Bridget, who advises on multiple country admission, if you have any thoughts on that.
Well, I mean, I can't set policy for universities, but just transparency for sure, and to make certain that they understand many of the difficulties that might arise with testing in different parts of the world. It's not as accessible, certainly the costs involved, and to just even be cognizant of the students' time, that universities want students who are engaged in the academic and social life of their communities, and it's really hard to maintain that kind of a vibrant life when you have to be paying so much attention to the tests.
Great. And my last question, we'll turn it over to you, is for Lindsay and Eloise. Access to test centers, test cancellations, natural disasters all occur and can be devastating to students, as we've heard, particularly from Bridget's perspective. How does your institution handle extreme situations for those students who, in the test flexible sense, have to submit something, or those who want to opt into submitting a test?
So we are able to be flexible. We understand that things happen, right? Natural disasters occur. Students may have not any access to take these additional tests, and they might not be in one of the curricula that allows them to go that more test optional route. This is something that if the student contacts us, if the school contacts us, we are able to work with on a case-by-case basis. I'm not able to give an umbrella answer that says everything is always just accounted for, and of course, but I will say we do work very hard in that case-by-case basis of understanding where students are coming from, what is accessible to them, and especially in the case of natural disasters and political turmoil that may have caused for additional problems, we will work with that student to make sure we can still utilize all of the other parts of the application that the student and the school can control.
We're exactly the same. We've worked with situations like this in the past couple of years. We will send emails to those students in areas that are affected and say, hey, we understand that something is going on in your area. We want to work with you. Please contact us. Being test optional for everybody is really nice, because if a test was canceled or they can't get to the test center or something like that, we're happy to flip a student who wanted to submit tests to a test optional student. So even if they can't get to the test center, there's no consequence because of an outstanding circumstance.
Great. We'll take a few questions from the audience to conclude. We'll ask someone else who hasn't spoken first, if you don't mind. I can do it. Any other questions, and then we'll come back. Yes.
Thank you very much for the great presentation. One question that, Bridget, when you were talking about student doubt and student concern, it made me think about at both George Washington and Chicago on if you're seeing any differences in rates. I think you, Lindsay, had already talked about students have more affinity, so that kind of implied to me that the deposit rate was higher. But what about the admission rate between the two groups of students who are opting out of testing? Or have you seen a difference in your admission rates?
I don't think we're seeing difference in admission rates. The students who are opting not to submit tests versus the students who are submitting tests, I think we're admitting at the same rate. We're using all of the same criteria otherwise, so it typically looks pretty close across the board.
Yeah, and as this is our first year, I don't have that data yet, and even if I did, it wouldn't be helpful because it would just be 1 year's look. And with that holistic review, we expect it to be a very similar answer to what GW has at this point.
Thank you for a wonderful presentation. I think as a counselor, a lot of my doubts are further strengthened. One of the doubt is that there is a whole myth that, the visa becomes an issue if the children don't do SAT or any standardized test. So I don't know if there is a communication between you folks and the embassy here, because I've seen, I don't know if you can establish correlationship between the number of cases I've seen, but I've seen children not writing standardized tests have a low possibility or probability of visa. Yeah. So that's one concern I think you need to address at your end.
Thank you. And I actually, this was raised to me recently from the Education USA
That's right.
office. And I think this is something that we will ask the NACA task force on testing to also explore. We do, I think, have a role through our advocacy efforts to help educate on test optional trends and policies and the other factors that institutions use to assess and evaluate applicants. And so we can certainly look to how we can help influence that.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Great job.
All right, thank you to my panelists. Thank you for joining us this early morning, and we'll stick around for further questions. Thanks.